The gentle morning breeze carried the faint scent of smoke through the mountain town of Pine Ridge. Mei Lin stood at her kitchen window, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching as golden sunlight filtered through the scattered clouds. At 8 months pregnant, she had imagined these final weeks would be filled with peaceful preparation, setting up the nursery, folding tiny clothes, and resting before her baby's arrival. Instead, an unsettling orange glow flickered on the distant horizon. Her husband Raj appeared behind her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "The news says the fire's still 20 miles away," he said softly, but his voice carried a hint of worry that he couldn't quite hide. Mei Lin nodded, trying to push down her growing anxiety. They had moved to Pine Ridge 3 years ago, drawn by its tight-knit community and the promise of a quieter life away from the busy city. Now, that decision weighed heavily on their minds. Throughout the morning, neighbors dropped by with updates and offers of help. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door brought over extra bottles of water and some homemade bread, while Mr. Thompson, the retired firefighter, shared his expertise about wind patterns and fire behavior. The community's spirit shone through even as concern grew with each passing hour. By early afternoon, the sky had transformed from crystal blue to an eerie sepia tone. The local radio station crackled with increasingly urgent updates. The fire had changed direction, accelerated by unexpected wind shifts. What had seemed like a distant threat that morning was now racing toward their small town with frightening speed. "We should leave now," Raj said, already gathering their emergency bags. They had packed them days ago, following the evacuation guidelines their community had practiced during fire drills. Mei Lin waddled to their bedroom, carefully collecting the baby supplies they'd need: diapers, formula just in case, and the soft yellow blanket her mother had knitted for the baby. The sound of car engines and voices filled the street as their neighbors began to evacuate. Raj loaded their car while Mei Lin made one final check of their home, her heart heavy as she looked at the nursery they had painted just last weekend, soft mint green walls adorned with hand-drawn butterflies. She snapped a quick photo, trying to hold on to this moment. But nature had other plans. As they drove toward the main road, they encountered a scene that made their hearts sink. A massive pine tree, weakened by recent storms, had fallen across the only paved road leading out of town. Several cars had already stopped, and people were gathering, their faces reflecting the same mix of fear and disbelief that Mei Lin felt. The local sheriff's deputy arrived minutes later, his expression grim as he assessed the situation. The alternate dirt road through the mountains wasn't safe for regular vehicles, especially not with a pregnant woman. The fire department's equipment that could move the tree was already deployed at the firefront. They were trapped. Mei Lin felt the baby kick, as if sensing her rising panic. She took deep breaths, remembering her prenatal classes. Rage squeezed her hand, his presence anchoring her. Around them, the community quickly began to organize. The town's community center, a sturdy building originally built as a Cold War bunker, would be their shelter. As they made their way to the center, Mei Lin noticed how people naturally fell into roles: the high school gym teacher coordinating the movement of supplies, the local nurse making lists of medical needs, and countless others working together. Despite the growing danger, there was something beautifully human about how crisis brought out the best in people. The sun was setting now, but nobody could tell through the thick smoke. The distant roar of the fire grew louder, punctuated by the sharp cracks of trees succumbing to the flames. Inside the community center, Mei Lin settled onto a makeshift bed, trying to stay calm. She felt a familiar tightening in her abdomen, not labor, she told herself, just Braxton Hicks contractions brought on by stress. But as the night drew closer and the fire's orange glow intensified, she exchanged a knowing look with Raj. Their baby might not wait for rescue. This wasn't the birth story they had planned, but they were surrounded by caring people who would help them through whatever came next. Sometimes, Mei Lin thought, the most extraordinary stories come from moments when life forces us to be braver than we ever thought possible. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as more people filed in, their faces dusty from the thickening smoke outside. Mei Lin watched from her corner as the large room quickly transformed into an organized refuge. Someone had pushed the plastic tables against the walls to make space for blankets and sleeping bags, creating a makeshift dormitory for the 32 trapped residents. Nurse Yamamoto, A petite woman in her 50s who usually ran the town's only medical clinic moved through the crowd with quiet efficiency. She carried her worn leather medical bag, checking on everyone, but paying special attention to Mei Lin. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her kind eyes crinkling with concern as she took Mei Lin's blood pressure. "The contractions are getting stronger," Mei Lin admitted, trying to keep her voice steady so Raj wouldn't worry more than he already was. He had joined a group of men attempting to seal the building's air vents with damp cloths to keep out the worst of the smoke. The building shuddered as another explosion echoed from somewhere in the forest, probably a propane tank from one of the outlying houses. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had brought them water earlier that morning, now sat nearby, clutching her rosary and whispering prayers in Spanish. Her grandson, Alberto, a tech-savvy teenager, kept trying to get a signal on his phone, hoping to contact emergency services. "No luck," he announced, shaking his head. "The cell towers must be down." He paused, then added hopefully, "But they must know we're here. They'll come for us soon." The afternoon crept by with agonizing slowness. The air grew warmer despite the building's thick concrete walls, and the smoke found its way in through tiny cracks. People took turns watching through the high windows, reporting on the fire's movement. The forest that had been their home was becoming an inferno. Mr. Chen, the owner of the local hardware store, no relation to Mei Lin despite sharing a surname, emerged from the storage room with armfuls of battery-powered fans. "Found these in the emergency supplies," he announced. "They're not much, but they'll help move the air around." His wife followed with bottles of water and granola bars, part of the center's earthquake preparedness stash. As evening approached, Mei Lin's contractions became impossible to ignore. They came in steady waves now, each one stronger than the last. Raj held her hand, his normally cheerful face etched with worry. Nurse Yamamoto noticed immediately and began converting a small office into a delivery room. "Listen up, everyone," she called out, her quiet voice somehow carrying across the room. "We need clean towels, bottled water, and any flashlights you can spare. We might be here all night, and we need to be prepared." The response was immediate. People emptied their emergency bags, sharing whatever they had. Mrs. Patel, who taught chemistry at the local high school, offered her reading glasses to Nurse Yamamoto for better visibility. Mr. Thompson, the retired firefighter, rigged up an ingenious system of battery-powered lanterns to provide better lighting. Outside, the world had turned into a hellscape of orange and red. The fire's roar was constant now, punctuated by the cracking of trees and distant crashes. But inside, a different kind of energy took hold. The community rallied around Mei Lin and Raj, creating a bubble of calm in the chaos. Old Mrs. Lee, who taught yoga at the senior center, showed Raj pressure points to help ease Mei Lin's pain. Alberto kept trying his phone, determined to get help. Mr. Chen distributed face masks from his store supplies, ensuring everyone had protection from the smoke. As night fell completely, the electricity flickered and died, leaving them dependent on their battery-powered lights. The heat was becoming unbearable, but no one complained. Instead, they'd formed a rotation, using magazines and pieces of cardboard as fans to keep air moving around Mei Lin. Through her pain, Mei Lin was struck by the beauty of it all. How these people, her neighbors who she mostly knew just from quick hellos at the grocery store or waves across the street, had become a kind of family. Each person found a way to help, telling stories to distract her between contractions, sharing water and snacks, offering words of encouragement. "My grandmother gave birth during a typhoon," Mrs. Rodriguez shared, had a voice warm with memory. "She always said babies born during natural disasters are special. They come into the world already knowing how to be strong." As midnight approached, the contractions were coming fast and strong. Nurse Yamamoto's face grew serious as she checked Mei Lin again. "The baby's coming soon," she announced. "We need to get ready." The community center, hot and smoke-tinged as it was, had become a sanctuary of hope. Despite the inferno raging outside, despite their fears and discomfort, these 32 people had created something remarkable. A circle of protection and care around a new life preparing to enter the world in the most extraordinary circumstances. Mei Lin squeezed Raj's hand as another contraction built. Through the high windows, the fire painted the sky in shades of orange and red, but inside their concrete shelter, humanity's best qualities shone even brighter than the flames. The small office-turned-delivery room felt like a world apart from the main shelter area. Nurse Yamamoto worked quickly, her movements precise despite the less-than-ideal conditions. The battery-powered lanterns cast long shadows on the walls, their light steady and reassuring against the orange glow seeping through the high windows. Deep breaths, just like we practiced, Rage encouraged, wiping Mei Lin's forehead with a damp cloth. The contractions were coming faster now, barely giving her time to recover between them. Outside, the fire's roar had grown so loud it seemed to make the building's foundations shudder. Mr. Thompson appeared at the door, his face streaked with soot from checking the building's ventilation. "The winds shifted," he reported, his voice low. "The fire's getting closer to the east side. We've sealed off what we can, but the smoke." Nurse Yamamoto nodded without looking up from her preparations. "We need more clean air in here," she said firmly. "The baby can't breathe smoke." The community sprang into action. Mr. Chen disappeared into the storage room and returned with a stack of plastic sheeting left over from some long-ago renovation project. Working with quiet efficiency, he and several others began sealing off the delivery room, creating a makeshift clean air chamber. Young Alberto, still clutching his phone, had rigged up a clever filtration system using spare air filters from Mr. Chen's hardware store inventory and the battery-operated fans. "My science fair project last year was about air purification," he explained, his hands steady as he worked. "Never thought I'd be using it like this." The minutes ticked by like hours. Mrs. Patel organized a chain of people passing fresh cool towels and water bottles, while Mrs. Lee led a group in keeping the air moving with improvised fans. Everyone had found their role in this unexpected drama, working together like a well-oiled machine. Through it all, Mei Lin fought each contraction with determination. The pain was intense, but there was something powerful about being surrounded by such care and community. Between contractions, she caught glimpses of the scene around her. Mrs. Rodriguez softly praying in the corner, Mr. Thompson constantly checking the windows and doors, Nurse Yamamoto's steady presence. "The baby's heartbeat is strong," Nurse Yamamoto announced after checking with her old stethoscope. "You're both doing wonderfully." She turned to Rage, who hadn't left his wife's side. "Keep talking to her. Your voice helps more than you know." A particularly loud crash from outside made everyone jump. Through the sealed windows, they could see trees falling in the distance, consumed by the advancing flames. The air grew warmer despite their best efforts at ventilation. "Tell me about the nursery again," Mei Lin asked between contractions, needing something to focus on besides the chaos outside. "Tell me about how we'll decorate it when we get home." Rage's voice cracked slightly as he began describing their plans. The soft mint green walls they'd painted, the wooden crib his father had helped him build, the mobile of paper cranes Mei Lin's mother had sent from overseas. Their simple dream of bringing their baby home seemed so distant now, but somehow talking about it made it feel real again. In the main room, the rest of the community kept busy. Someone had found an old radio, and though they couldn't get any signals through the interference, they kept trying. Others organized supplies, tended to the elderly, and maintained their watch at the windows. Every so often, someone would report movement in the fire's pattern, each update carrying the weight of their collective hopes for rescue. As the night deepened, the heat became almost unbearable. Sweat beaded on everyone's foreheads, but nobody complained. Instead, they'd focused on their tasks, passing fresh towels, maintaining the makeshift air filtration system, keeping watch, and most importantly, supporting Mei Lin through each contraction. "I see emergency lights." Alberto suddenly called from his post by the window. "They're trying to reach us." The news sent a ripple of hope through the room, but Nurse Yamamoto remained focused on the immediate task at hand. "The baby's not waiting for rescue," she said calmly, checking Mei Lin again. "We're going to do this ourselves, right here, right now." This little one is determined to make quite an entrance. Mei Lin gripped Raja's hand tighter as another contraction built. Through the pain, she was aware of everything. The warmth of her husband's hand, the steady presence of Nurse Yamamoto, the quiet efficiency of her neighbors working to keep them safe, the distant sound of sirens mixing with the fire's roar. In this moment, surrounded by relative strangers who had become family in the space of a few hours, Mei Lin felt an overwhelming sense of strength. This wasn't the birth she had planned, but there was something powerful about bringing new life into the world surrounded by such extraordinary examples of human kindness and resilience. "Okay," Nurse Yamamoto said, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "It's time to push. Let's bring this miracle baby into the world." The community center had become a world of its own, separated from the inferno outside by concrete walls and human determination. In the main room, people moved with purpose, each person finding ways to help despite their own fears. The air was thick with smoke that sneaked through tiny cracks, but also heavy with hope and shared purpose. Mrs. Patel had organized what she called the supply chain, a human relay passing fresh towels, water, and supplies to the makeshift delivery room. "Keep them coming," she directed, her teacher's voice carrying naturally over the chaos. "Fold the towels in quarters, just like this." Her hands demonstrated the motion, quick and precise, as others followed her lead. In one corner, Mr. Chen worked with Alberto and two others to improve their makeshift air filtration system. They had dismantled several fans and combined them with air filters to create a crude but effective way to clean the air. "If we angle them just right," Alberto explained, adjusting a fan, "we can create a flow of cleaner air toward the delivery room." Mrs. Rodriguez had gathered a small group near the center of the room, their voices rising and falling in gentle harmony as they sang soft lullabies in different languages. The music provided a calming counterpoint to the fire's roar and helped mask the sounds of Mei Lin's labor from the younger children in the group. Mr. Thompson maintained his post by the windows, his years of firefighting experience helping him read the fire's movements. "The wind's shifting again," he announced, his voice steady despite the concern in his eyes. "The flames are moving more to the north now." He paused, calculating. "That might buy us some time." The elderly Mrs. Lee had taken charge of keeping everyone's spirits up. She moved from person to person, sharing stories from her long life, including tales of other difficult times that people had survived together. During the big earthquake of '89, she told a worried-looking young mother, strangers became family in just hours. "That's what humans do. We come together when things are hardest." Near the building's entrance, a group worked to maintain their barricade against the smoke. They had used wet blankets and towels to seal the gaps around doors and windows, checking and re-wetting them regularly. The work was constant, but no one complained. Each person understood their role in protecting the new life about to enter the world. "Water Brigade," called out Mrs. Patel, and immediately several people moved to pass fresh bottles forward. They had discovered a storage room with emergency supplies, including cases of water, and were carefully rationing it. Some of the teenagers had organized themselves into teams, making sure everyone, especially the elderly and children, stayed hydrated in the growing heat. The sounds from the delivery room grew more intense, and everyone tried to work faster, more efficiently. Mr. Chen's wife started sorting through their emergency supplies, looking for anything that could be useful for a newborn. She found some clean soft towels that had been meant for first aid situations, and someone else discovered a cache of safety pins and clean sheets. "Does anyone have any baby experience?" Mrs. Patel asked the room, and several hands went up. A retired pediatric nurse, a mother of 4, and a daycare worker stepped forward. They gathered near the delivery room, ready to help if needed. In this crisis, everyone's skills found a purpose. Alberto hadn't given up on his attempts to contact the outside world. He had climbed onto a chair, holding his phone up near one of the high windows. "The emergency services might be able to track our location if even one message gets through," he explained to anyone who would listen. His dedication gave others hope. Someone out there must be looking for them. The building shuddered as another tree fell nearby, and a child started crying. Without missing a beat, Mrs. Rodriguez switched from her prayers to a cheerful children's song, and others joined in. The simple act of singing together seemed to lift everyone's spirits, creating a bubble of normalcy in their extraordinary situation. Hours had passed since they'd taken shelter, but no one spoke of time anymore. Instead, they marked the passage of moments by tasks completed, supplies distributed, and the steady rhythm of their collective efforts to support Mei Lin and her coming baby. Through it all, the community center's old walls held strong. The building had been built decades ago as a Cold War shelter, its designers never imagining it would one day protect a group of neighbors coming together to help bring new life into the world during a wildfire. "Look," someone called out suddenly. Through the smoky haze visible from the windows, they could see flashing lights in the distance. The emergency vehicles were still trying to reach them, fighting against the fire to find a safe route. The sight renewed everyone's energy. Help was out there, trying to reach them. But for now, they had each other. As another of Mei Lin's cries echoed from the delivery room, the community moved as one, passing supplies, maintaining their air system, singing softly, and praying in their own ways. In this moment, they weren't just neighbors anymore. They had become something more. A family forged in crisis, united in their determination to protect a mother and her unborn child from the inferno that raged outside their walls. In the makeshift delivery room, time seemed to stand still. The air was thick with anticipation as Mei Lin's labor reached its final stages. Nurse Yamamoto's calm voice guided her through each push, while Rage held her hand, whispering words of encouragement. The battery-powered lanterns cast a warm glow across the room, creating an almost sacred atmosphere despite the chaos outside. "You're doing wonderfully," Nurse Yamamoto said, her experienced eyes carefully monitoring both mother and baby's progress. "Just a few more pushes now." Her voice carried decades of experience, steady and reassuring even as the building trembled from another nearby explosion. In the main room, the community had fallen into a reverent hush, broken only by the necessary communications of their ongoing tasks. Mrs. Patel continued coordinating the supply chain, but now her directions came in whispers. The singing had softened to gentle humming, led by Mrs. Rodriguez's soothing voice. "The fire's holding at the north side," Mr. Thompson reported quietly from his window post. "The wind's working in our favor now." His updates had become like a heartbeat for the group, marking time and giving them hope. The orange glow outside painted everything in surreal colors, filtering through the sealed windows despite their best efforts. A particularly strong contraction gripped Mei Lin, and her cry echoed through the community center. In response, the humming grew slightly louder, as if the whole community was trying to share their strength with her. Alberto, still by the window with his phone, started streaming the Chinese lullaby he'd downloaded earlier. The one Mei Lin had mentioned was her favorite when she was a child. "I can see the head," Nurse Yamamoto announced, her professional composure brightening with excitement. "One more big push, Mei Lin. Your baby's almost here." The clock on the wall, barely visible in the lantern light, showed 3:45 a.m. Raj's eyes filled with tears as he supported his wife. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby is so lucky to have you as a mother." The next few moments were a blur of intensity. The fire outside seemed to roar louder, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Mei Lin gathered her remaining strength, squeezing Raj's hand so tight he later joked she nearly broke it. With one final, powerful push at exactly 3:47 a.m., their baby entered the world. The newborn's first cry pierced the air, strong, defiant, and beautiful. It cut through the sound of the fire, through the fear and exhaustion, through everything. In that moment, everyone in the community center felt their hearts lift. Some people cried, others hugged, and Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself, whispering, "Gracias a Dios." "It's a girl," Nurse Yamamoto announced joyfully, quickly checking the baby over. "A beautiful, healthy baby girl." She worked efficiently to clean the newborn and wrap her in one of the soft, clean towels Mr. Chen's wife had found earlier. The baby's cry was strong and healthy, a sound that brought tears to many eyes in the main room. It was as if this tiny new person was announcing to the world that even in the midst of a natural disaster, life would find a way to continue to thrive. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, Nurse Yamamoto announced, using an old scale they'd found in the first aid supplies. Perfect in every way. She placed the swaddled baby on Mei Lin's chest, where the newborn immediately began to quiet, sensing her mother's warmth. Mei Lin and Raj gazed at their daughter in wonder. Despite the smoke outside, despite the heat and the fear and the uncertainty, this moment was pure magic. The baby opened her eyes briefly, dark eyes seeming to take in the strange world she'd been born into. In the main room, the celebration was quiet but heartfelt. Mrs. Lee started passing around bottles of water she'd been saving for a special moment. "To new life," she whispered, and everyone took a small sip in honor of the baby's arrival. Mr. Thompson stepped away from his window post for just a moment to update everyone. "The fire's still out there," he said softly, "but it seems like it's giving us a moment to celebrate." Indeed, even the wind seemed to have died down slightly, as if nature itself was acknowledging this miracle. Alberto, who had finally given up on his phone, started making a list of everyone present at the birth. "This baby's going to want to know everyone who was here when she grows up," he explained, his young face serious with the responsibility. "We're all part of her story now." The retired pediatric nurse who had been waiting to help stepped forward to assist Nurse Yamamoto with the post-birth care. Together, they made sure both mother and baby were comfortable and healthy, working with the limited supplies they had, but with unlimited care and attention. As the baby nursed for the first time, Mei Lin looked around at the faces of her neighbors, now her family, in a way she'd never expected. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tired but full of emotion. "Thank you all." The morning was still hours away, and the fire still raged outside, but in this moment, inside these strong walls, a new life had brought them all a profound sense of hope. They had witnessed a miracle together, and no one who was present would ever forget this night, when a community united to help bring one tiny, precious person into the world. The first hints of dawn began to filter through the smoke-stained windows of the community center. The night's darkness was slowly giving way to a strange, hazy light that painted the world in shades of gray and orange. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from tense anticipation to quiet celebration, though everyone remained alert to the danger that still surrounded them. The newborn baby girl slept peacefully in her mother's arms, wrapped in clean towels and seemingly unaware of the extraordinary circumstances of her birth. Mei Lin had dozed off as well, exhausted but radiant, while Rage sat beside them, unable to take his eyes off his family. Nurse Yamamoto continued her vigilant care, checking on mother and baby regularly. Mr. Thompson stood at his usual post by the window, squinting through the murky air. "The fire's different now," he announced, his experienced eye noting subtle changes in the smoke patterns. "It's moved further north, and the wind." He paused, studying the movement of the trees. "The wind's starting to shift again." The community center's other occupants had settled into a weary but watchful routine. Some dozed in corners, while others maintained their vital tasks, keeping the air filtering system running, monitoring their dwindling supplies, and watching for any signs of rescue. The building had protected them through the night, its thick walls standing firm against the inferno outside. Around 5:30 a.m., Alberto, who had never given up his post near the window with his phone, suddenly straightened up. "I got a bar," he shouted, then immediately lowered his voice, remembering the sleeping baby. "I got a signal, just for a second, but it was there." Mrs. Patel, who had been organizing their remaining supplies, hurried over. "Can you send a message? Let them know we're here." Her usually neat hair had come loose from its bun, giving her a disheveled appearance that somehow made her look more determined than ever. The teenager worked frantically, his fingers flying over the phone's keyboard. Come on," he muttered, holding the phone up higher. A moment later, his face lit up. It sent. The message went through. The news rippled through the room, bringing renewed energy to the weary group. Mrs. Rodriguez began another prayer, while Mr. Chen and his wife hugged each other, tears in their eyes. Even Mrs. Lee, who had remained stoic throughout the night, allowed herself a small smile. Just then, Mr. Thompson's voice cut through the quiet buzz of conversation. "Listen," he commanded, and everyone fell silent. In the distance, barely audible over the fire's continuous roar, came a new sound, the distinctive whomp-whomp-whomp of helicopter blades. "The roof!" Mrs. Patel exclaimed. "We need to signal them." Without waiting for a response, she and several others began gathering flashlights and anything reflective they could find. The community center had a small roof access hatch, used for maintenance, and within minutes, a group had carefully made their way up to create a signal. Through breaks in the smoke, they could see the helicopter circling, searching. Using mirrors from purses and compact cases, they reflected what light they could catch, desperate to be noticed. The helicopter's searchlight swept back and forth, a beam of hope cutting through the smoky dawn. Down in the main room, Nurse Yamamoto and Raj had carefully moved Mei Lin and the baby to a more central location, away from the windows, just in case an emergency evacuation became necessary. The baby stirred but didn't wake, her tiny face peaceful despite the growing excitement around her. At 6:15 am exactly. Alberto noted the time on his phone, the helicopter's searchlight fixed directly on their building. The sound of the rotors grew louder, and through the windows, they could see it preparing to land in the parking lot, its skilled pilot finding just enough space among the fallen trees. The first rescue worker to enter the building was met with an unexpected sight. Instead of finding panic and chaos, he discovered a community that had organized itself into a functioning unit. And in the center of it all, a newborn baby slept soundly, surrounded by 32 people who had become family overnight. "We've got a newborn here," Mr. Thompson reported to the rescue team, falling easily into his old first responder communication patterns. "Mother and baby are stable, thanks to our nurse, but they'll need medical attention." He quickly briefed them on the others present, the elderly, the children, those with medical conditions that needed attention. The rescue worker's face showed clear amazement as he radioed back to his team. More helicopters were already on the way, he explained, but they would need to prioritize the evacuations. Without hesitation, everyone agreed. Mai Lin and the baby would go last, after those in more urgent need of medical care were evacuated. "We've taken care of them all night," Mrs. Lee said firmly when Mai Lin tried to protest. "We can take care of them a little longer." The others nodded in agreement, their faces showing the same determination that had gotten them through the night. As the sun continued to rise, painting the smoke-filled sky in surreal colors, the rescue operation began in earnest. The community that had come together in crisis now worked just as efficiently to help with the evacuation, passing supplies, helping the elderly, and maintaining their organization right up until the end. Through it all, the baby slept peacefully, unaware that her birth story would become part of their town's history. A reminder of how ordinary people could show extraordinary courage and kindness when faced with impossible circumstances. 1 year later, the community center buzzed with excitement once again, but this time under very different circumstances. Streamers and balloons decorated the renovated space, and a large banner read, "Happy First Birthday, Little Phoenix." The nickname had stuck. The community's miracle baby, born in the midst of fire, was now celebrating her first year of life. Mei Lin watched her daughter toddle between the guests, accepting cuddles and kisses from everyone who had been present on that extraordinary night. The baby had grown into a cheerful, curious little girl with bright eyes and an infectious laugh. She seemed to have a special connection with everyone there, as if she somehow remembered the night they had all come together to protect her. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in her usual spot, now marked by a comfortable chair donated specifically for community gatherings. "Look how she walks already," she exclaimed as the birthday girl wobbled past. "Just like I said, babies born during disasters are special." Her grandson Alberto, now a high school senior, was showing younger kids how he had rigged up the emergency air filtration system that night. The community center itself had been transformed. After the fire, the town had rallied to renovate it, turning it into an even better emergency shelter while preserving its role as a gathering place. The walls had been reinforced, new ventilation systems installed, and proper medical supplies stored. But most notably, a beautiful plaque hung near the entrance, telling the story of the night when 32 neighbors became family. Mr. Thompson, who still volunteered with the fire department's community education program, often used their story to teach others about emergency preparedness. But it's not just about the supplies, he would say, it's about the people. It's about knowing your neighbors and being ready to help each other. Nurse Yamamoto had retired from her clinic, but still attended every community event. She watched her former patients with pride, especially little Phoenix, who she considered almost like a grandchild. The birth certificate listed her as the attending physician, but she always insisted that everyone present that night had helped bring Phoenix into the world. The Chen family had rebuilt their hardware store, now with an expanded emergency preparedness section. They offered free community workshops on disaster readiness, and their first aid kits came with a reminder card about the importance of knowing your neighbors. "You never know when you'll need each other," Mr. Chen would say, remembering how every item they'd had that night found a crucial purpose. Mrs. Patel had incorporated the story into her teaching, using it to show her students how community and quick thinking could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Her former student Alberto had even won a science scholarship inspired by his experience creating the emergency air filtration system. Mrs. Lee still taught her yoga classes, but now they were held in the community center's new multipurpose room. She had added special breathing exercises to her routine, the same ones that had helped Mei Lin during her labor. Every breath is a gift, she would remind her students, thinking back to that smoke-filled night. The party was in full swing when Rage brought out the cake, shaped like the community center itself, complete with tiny fondant figures representing everyone who had been there. The detail that touched everyone's hearts was the tiny LED lights placed inside, making the cake glow just like their battery-powered lanterns had done that night. As they gathered to sing Happy Birthday, photos from the past year played on a screen nearby. Phoenix's first smile, her first steps, and countless moments with her extended community family. Every person there had played a part in her monthly milestones, from Mrs. Rodriguez teaching her first words in Spanish to Mr. Thompson carrying her on his shoulders during community parades. The town itself had changed too. The fire had destroyed much, but the rebuilding process had brought people even closer together. New fire breaks had been created, emergency protocols updated, and community bonds strengthened. Every new family that moved to town was welcomed with the story of Phoenix's birth, a reminder that they weren't just moving to a place, but joining a family. After the cake was cut and served, Mei Lin stood to address the gathering. Her voice shook slightly with emotion as she looked at the faces around her, no longer just neighbors, but the people who had become her daughter's guardians on the very first night of her life. 1 year ago, she began, holding Phoenix in her arms, we were all strangers in the dark, facing what seemed impossible. Today, we're family, celebrating not just Phoenix's birth, but the rebirth of our community. Every time my daughter smiles, I see the light of hope you all kept burning that night. The afternoon continued with stories being shared, children playing, and plans being made for future gatherings. The community center, once just a building, had become a symbol of their resilience and unity. Its walls now held not just emergency supplies, but the living memory of how ordinary people could come together to create something extraordinary. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the new windows, Phoenix fell asleep in Mrs. Lee's arms, surrounded by the love of her unique and beautiful extended family. The legacy of that fiery night lived on, not just in the story they would always tell, but in the daily acts of kindness and connection that had become the heartbeat of their community.